Hello everyone, and a very good day to you. First of all, congratulations for enrolling yourselves and registering for this very important course on safety planning and implementation in the context of systemic risks and in accordance with the commitments of the 2030 agenda. I really do hope that you've been having a great course so far and are all ready to go for the next module. My name is Dr. Kamal Ahmed, and I'll be facilitating your next session on making the economic case for safer schools, which is module 1.5. I hope you're done so far with the previous modules, which were Introduction to School Safety as a key element of the 2030 agenda, and International Architecture for Safe Schools, linking humanitarian and development agenda, and are ready to dive into the making economic case for safe schools. But before we start with the economic case, there are some initial considerations that we need to bear in mind. The first one being that disasters became more devastating because of their nature, frequency, and growing economic costs. Besides, the readily changing climate is seriously challenging the risk mitigation capacities built over time. The next consideration that we need to bear in mind is that governments at the sovereign level in the region are facing challenges with limited capacities to respond, and the fact that few of the total damages were insured underlines the fiscal pressures each country on its own and the entire region as a whole has to undergo as a direct result of natural hazards and disasters. One of the most important considerations that we need to keep in mind is that fiscal constraints has been affected public investment in social areas. And last but not the least, low growth and lack of competitiveness are prevailing macroeconomic characteristics, aggravating accumulation of current account deficits and unsustainable debt level. Now, if we compare the data from the last 2 decades of the 20th century and the first 2 of the 21st century, we'll immediately realize that the number of natural hazards and disasters have gone significantly higher, from 4,000 to almost 7,000, whereas the number of total deaths have mildly gone up from 1.19 million to 1.23 million. The number of total affected people and the dollar value of the economic losses have tremendously gone higher, from 3.25 billion to 4.03 and from $1.63 trillion to $2.97 trillion respectively. Now, this shows the increasing frequency of natural hazards as well as the increasing nature of costliness of the natural hazards. Now, if we look at the map of MENA region and the African continent, what we'll realize is that the region is partly vulnerable and prone to earthquakes and tropical cyclones. Now, the problem is that records are particularly incomplete from Africa, and only 13% of all disasters and events are reported in Africa for any economic loss. The reported events have calculated a $27 billion worth loss in Africa, which is merely a 1% of the entire global damage. With the advent of COVID-19 pandemic, what we realized was that our social sectors, particularly education, is highly vulnerable to such shocks from natural hazards as well as pandemics. The enormous economic burdens caused to the education system as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic have emphasized the need to enhance the overall investments in the education sector and the comprehensive school safety framework in particular. Now, we'll go to the Caribbean case where we conducted the first school safety economic analysis. And before that, we need to understand the human capital development and education linkage. Human capital development can improve Caribbean competitiveness. This will involve completing social programs with an improved education system. In terms of education coverage, the main challenges remain at pre-primary and tertiary levels. The Caribbean has achieved universal primary education and near secondary education with some exception. Yet, Caribbean countries lag behind in terms of early childhood and tertiary education. Recent economic challenges have triggered a step backward in access to tertiary education. Some challenges are related to fiscal setbacks, which have led to reduced subsidies for higher education. If we look at the natural hazards prevalence data, what we'll realize is that the region is particularly vulnerable to climate change and other hydrometeorological phenomena. For instance, looking at this chart, we'll notice that only 3% of the natural hazards were earthquakes, The remaining 97% of the natural hazards during the last 10 years were drought, storm, and floods, which were all climate change related phenomena and hydrometeorological phenomena. By looking at the lives lost, the Caribbean region lost around 250,000 people. 26 million people were affected, whereas the damages were $98 billion. And out of those $98 billion damages, only $37.7 billion were insured. This enormous protection gap makes us realize that there is enormous fiscal pressure on the Caribbean economy. Now, looking at the Caribbean risk profile, which has been derived from the World Bank's risk index and adapted for the region, we have divided the region in 5 major categories. Whereas the index class was from 0.31 to 3.29, it was devised as very low. The next category from 3.30 to 5.67 was a low category. The next category, 5.68 to 7.58, was a medium category, whereas 7.59 to 10.75 and 10.76 to 49.74 were devised as high and very high risk categories. For the countries where there were no data available, it was unclassified. And from looking at the risks, we can see that Haiti and Dominican Republic, Jamaica and Guyana are amongst the very high risk countries, whereas the Bahamas have amongst the lowest risk. For the socio-economic profile, we have plotted the World Risk Index, a regional index, government expenditure on education, total percentage of government expenditure on education, total percentage of GDP, and GDP growth as annual percentage. And very superficially speaking, without drawing any statistical correlation, we can see wherever the government expenditure is high, the risk index scores low. On the right side, the demographic structure of each country and the overall Caribbean average shows us that Belize and Grenada are amongst the youngest population in the region. The average population for the Caribbean region shows us that almost more than half of the population is below 25, which means there is a tremendous role for education to play as we talk about resilience and systemic risks. Coming to the economic calculation, economic returns to an intervention are usually calculated via the economic internal rate of return, for which net present and future values of cash flows are accounted for. It is a summary of the costs and benefits of the investments incurred at different points of time. To calculate economic returns in the context of school safety, the following equation was modified from the work of Bohn and Das on private and social rates of return to higher education in science and technology in a Caribbean economy. For the internal rate of return, the costs and the benefit must be equalized. According to this equation, CI represents the actual direct cost of intervention, which is the comprehensive school safety in this case, whereas CI-1 refers to the opportunity cost of the intervention. On the other hand of the equation, we have WI, which refers to the benefits generated as a result of school safety implementation, and WI-1 represent benefits generated in the absence of school safety intervention, whereas 1 plus R raised to the power -1 talks about the discounting rate. In the absence of a budget-tagged expenditure on school safety throughout the Caribbean region, as well as most of the countries in the world, we had to use proxies for this study. And the proxies that were utilized for the sake of calculations were government expenditures on education and reconstruction costs from previous disasters. Since the natural hazards are probabilistic in nature, Gumbel distribution had to be applied, and the economic benefits were annuitized for natural hazards. An average return rate for natural hazards was assumed as at 50 years, with an assumption that 5 to 10% of education budget goes to school safety. As a result, the benefit-cost ratio results came out to be 4.9 to 12.1. However, the limitation of this entire exercise was untaxed expenditure as well as lack of relevant data. Coming back to the result of BCR, 4.9 to 12.1 throughout the Caribbean region, tells us, and we can interpret the results as an investment of $1 in school safety saves us $4.9 in response to $12 in response throughout the Caribbean region. The considerations and assumptions need to be kept in mind was that the logic that has been used for the use of proxy variable is that both expenditure on comprehensive school safety and expenditure on education ensure access to education, which is a basic human right. Two critical assumptions here in this case, the first one being that governments allocate 5 to 10% of total expenditure on education towards comprehensive school safety, whereas the second one being economic benefits are taken from the reconstruction cost of education sector from the previous disaster, since the reconstruction cost was realized in the absence of comprehensive school safety. If we look at the data from the school closure through Caribbean region due to COVID-19, we come to notice that each country in itself was severely affected by COVID-19 pandemic in the context of school closure, which meant serious education disruption. Countries like Antigua, Barbuda, San Martin, Grenada were seriously affected, whereas Anguilla and St. Kitts and Nevis were not closed for such a long time. However, it needs to be noticed that this does not necessarily guarantee success or failure of a government. Unfolding the entire data for subregions tells the same story. Each country was seriously affected. For countries where there was no data available, we see there is the school closure as 0. However, the fact is that everywhere the schools were closed and serious education disruptions were noticed throughout the region. In the case of Greater Antilles, Dominican Republic were closed for 35 weeks throughout a calendar year, and Puerto Rico. In the case of Puerto Rico, there was no data available. Some particular considerations for the Caribbean context that need to be remembered are social inclusion remains a challenge for Caribbean small states. Despite recent improvements, more than half of the region's population remains vulnerable to poverty. In least developing countries and small island developing states, a large percentage of the population still lives under the poverty line. Poverty and vulnerability are mainly influenced by gender and regional disparities, levels of education, occupation and quality of employment, size and composition of the household, number of household members employed, and quality of housing. The fact that merely 1/3 of total damages were insured underlines the fiscal pressures each country on its own and the entire region as a whole has to undergo as a direct result of natural hazards and disasters, as explained in the previous slide. Some important economic considerations to all the ripple economic effects and systemic risks. Wherever there is low or nil investment in school safety, it directly contributes to augmenting physical vulnerability, economic vulnerability, social vulnerability, environmental vulnerability, as well as governance vulnerability. We have taken a very standard case of what we have seen in most of the hazards and disasters throughout the countries in the world. As a result of low investment in school safety, a structural collapse is very likely to happen. As a result of structural collapse, there is a cascading effect and there are ripple economic effects. The structural collapse leads to debris and life loss, which result into disruption of school feeding programs and loss of labor forces and entrepreneurial exits, which cumulatively result into reduced school days, loss of public revenue, and reduced national productivity. Now, each of these cascading effects contribute to physical vulnerability in case of debris, in case of economic vulnerability, life loss, loss of labor force, reduced national productivity, loss of public revenue, reduced school days contribute directly to economic vulnerability. Life loss in case of loss of income earner, sole income earner, or disruption of school feeding programs directly contributes to social vulnerability. The debris causes increase in or enhancement of environmental vulnerability, and whereas the entire scheme talks about governance vulnerability because this entire situation had took place because of low or nil investments in school safety. Now, it's given that most of the Caribbean countries are struggling economies when it comes to the aftermath of natural hazards, and therefore there is a need to rely on ex-ante financial planning for safer schools. This is a generic scheme for impact bond, where an investor is entrusted as much as in a social impact as much as it's interested in the return on investments. Therefore, the investors and government, they agree to invest through an intermediary, through a service provider, to make sure there is an impact about a certain target. For instance, in this case, we talk about comprehensive school safety. After X period, which can be 2-3 years, depending on the agreement of the nature of agreement, the evaluator evaluates the impact. If the impact is there, the government signals to the intermediary, and the returns on investments are released to the investor. Now, an impact bond cannot necessarily resolve all the issues on the ground. However, it provides a stepping stone for achieving fiscal resilience and preparing for improved comprehensive school safety. Talking about public imperative versus policy choice. In the case of natural hazards, every government has contingent liabilities that it has to pay, and it's a moral and social duty which is necessary, which is non-legislated. It can be humanitarian assistance. However, on the other hand, the government can opt for policy choices. We have seen that the comprehensive school safety can contribute to poverty reduction because it safeguards your future labor force, and it safeguards your sole income earners. On the other hand, stimulation of economic growth, assistance to affected households and businesses can be provided through safety. While the effects of an event on infrastructure and physical assets are relatively easy to estimate in monetary terms, it is more difficult to estimate the financial implications of a disaster on teaching and learning process. Shelters give us a situation where affecting education service provision and quality if mixing shelter with schools. On the other hand, due to the physical and internal effects from schools not being fully operational, implications could arise where there may be an increase of the total number of children out of schools. Several signs of post-trauma were observed in kids, families, and among teachers in the school communities. And there could also be an increase in the number of children with disabilities or significant injuries for whom the temporary or transitional learning centers would be less than accessible. With the demand for additional labor, both at home and in the market, children and the adolescents may prioritize working to support families due to major loss of family income from the disaster. Income losses due to school closure. According to Hanushek and Wisman 2020, the students in grade 1 to 12 affected by the closures might expect some 3% lower income over their entire lifetime. For nations, the lower long-term growth related to such losses might yield an average of 1.5% lower annual GDP for the remainder of the century. These economic losses would grow if schools are unable to restart quickly. Now, the cost implication. Affected students whose schooling has been interrupted by the pandemic face long-term losses in income. As a result, national economies that go forward with a less skilled labor force face lower economic growth, which subtracts from the overall welfare of the society. Subsequently, socio-emotional and motivational development of the affected children and adolescents. Development in these areas is restricted by the lack of contact with classmates and the psychological strain on families during an extended stay in sometimes cramped housing conditions. Ripple effects of closed schools and lost learning, structural collapse, declaration of schools as a temporary shelter, and pandemic simply adds up to the physical vulnerability, economic, social, environmental, and even vulnerability related to governance as stated in the previous slides. Finally, summarizing the entire session with the slide for ex-ante financial planning for safer schools, we need to emphasize more and more that ex-ante plans for financing and securing comprehensive schools rather than looking at ex-post financing for recovery and reconstruction is the way forward for achieving comprehensive safer schools.